Imagine standing at the edge of an ancient village as summer begins to fade. The fields have turned gold, baskets are heavy with grain, fruit hangs ripe from the trees, and animals are being prepared for the cold months ahead. Yet there is no electricity, no refrigerator humming in the corner, no freezer, no supermarket, and no truck arriving with fresh supplies. Once winter closes the roads, once drought burns the soil, or once war cuts a settlement off from its neighbors, the food already gathered may be all that stands between life and starvation. Fresh meat can spoil within days. Milk may sour before the next sunrise. Fish begins to decay almost as soon as it leaves the water. Fruit collapses into mold, vegetables soften, and grain can be destroyed by insects, moisture, or hungry rodents. For the people of the ancient world, preserving food was not a domestic convenience. It was a struggle against time itself. Every household, village, army, and kingdom depended on methods that could hold back decay long enough to survive a season, complete a journey, or endure a failed harvest. Long before anyone had seen a bacterium or understood the science of microorganisms, human beings had already learned that heat, water, air, insects, and contamination determined how quickly food deteriorated. They did not know the invisible mechanisms, but they knew the patterns. Meat left in a warm place became dangerous. Grain stored while damp turned black with mold. Fish exposed to smoke lasted longer. Fruit left beneath a dry sun shrank but remained sweet. Milk changed into thicker, sharper foods that could be carried far beyond the moment of milking. This knowledge was not invented in a single year or discovered by one famous person. It emerged slowly through countless observations, mistakes, illnesses, experiments, and memories passed from one generation to the next. The result was a network of preservation techniques so effective that some of them remain part of human life today. To understand how people survived before refrigerators, we must first understand why food spoiled so quickly. Fresh food contains water, and water creates the conditions in which many forms of decay thrive. Warmth speeds the process. Air changes fats, colors, and flavors. Flies land on exposed meat and deposit eggs. Beetles enter stores of grain. Mice can consume or contaminate supplies meant to feed an entire family. Containers washed with dirty water spread illness, while damp walls and leaking roofs ruin carefully gathered harvests. Ancient people could not test food in laboratories, but they watched closely. They smelled it, touched it, cut it open, and compared it with earlier batches. Over time, they recognized that reducing moisture, lowering temperature, limiting air, adding salt, increasing acidity, or encouraging certain controlled changes could slow destruction. Their methods did more than keep meals edible. They allowed human communities to settle permanently instead of moving whenever local food disappeared. They made it possible to support craftsmen, priests, rulers, soldiers, and laborers who did not produce their own food every day. They helped cities grow, armies march, ships cross open water, and merchants carry goods over distances that would otherwise have been impossible. The first and simplest weapon against spoilage was the sun. Drying food is among the oldest preservation methods known to humanity because it required no complex machine, only heat, moving air, patience, and protection from animals. A hunter, returning with more meat than the group could immediately eat, faced a problem. If the flesh remained thick and wet, it would soon rot. But when cut into narrow strips and placed where sunlight and wind could reach every surface, much of its moisture slowly disappeared. As the meat became lighter, darker, and firmer, it also became less welcoming to the organisms that caused decay. The same principle worked with fish. Along rivers, lakes, and coasts, fresh catches were cleaned, opened, and laid on stones, mats, raised wooden frames, or woven racks. Some fish were split down the middle so the sun could reach the flesh. Others were hung from cords where the wind helped carry moisture away. Families watched the weather carefully because a sudden rain could undo days of work. Children might be sent to chase away birds, while adults turned the pieces so that both sides dried evenly. Insects remained a constant threat. Dust could settle on the food, animals could steal it, and thick sections might appear dry outside while still holding moisture within. Successful drying required experience. A person had to know the right thickness, the strength of the sun, the amount of wind, and the point at which the food was dry enough to store but not burned or ruined. Plants were preserved in similar ways. Grapes became raisins. Figs, dates, and apricots lost water while their sweetness became concentrated. Herbs were tied in bundles and hung in shaded air. Mushrooms, roots, and sliced vegetables could be spread on rooftops or mats. In many places, people dried grain before placing it into storage because even a small amount of trapped moisture might destroy the entire supply. Dried food offered another advantage. It was lighter. Hunters could carry it, traders could transport it, and soldiers could march with it. A piece of fresh meat was heavy with water and quickly became unsafe, but dried strips could remain useful for much longer. They could be chewed as they were, softened in water, or added to soups and stews. In cold environments, freezing winds sometimes helped dry food naturally, while in hot deserts, the sun performed the task with extraordinary speed. Yet drying alone was never perfect. Humid climates made it difficult, unexpected storms brought danger, and pests could still reach the stored supply. Human beings, therefore, combined it with other methods, and among the most powerful was salt. To ancient communities, salt was far more than a seasoning. It was a preservative, a trade good, a source of wealth, and in some regions, a substance valuable enough to influence political power. Salt could be collected where seawater evaporated under the sun, scraped from the edges of salt lakes, dug from mineral deposits, or mined from underground. Producing and transporting it required labor, which made it expensive in places far from natural sources. Yet its ability to protect food made that effort worthwhile. When salt touched meat or fish, it drew out moisture. The surface became less favorable to many organisms, and the food changed in texture and taste. A fish might be cleaned, split, rubbed heavily with salt, and packed into a jar. Layers of fish and salt could be stacked one above another until the container was full. Meat could be buried beneath crystals, pressed into barrels, or soaked in strong brine. Salt entered cuts and cavities where decay might begin. Sometimes the food was dried after salting, and sometimes it was later exposed to smoke. These combined methods were far more reliable than any one technique used alone. Salted food could be extremely hard and intensely flavored. Before eating it, people often soaked it in fresh water or boiled it to remove some of the salt. Even then, it did not taste like fresh meat. Preservation was not about maintaining perfect quality. It was about creating something that remained edible when fresh supplies were gone. Fishing communities depended heavily on this process. A large catch could not always be consumed locally, but once salted and packed, it could be carried inland. Merchants transported preserved fish far from the coast, feeding populations that might never see the sea. Armies carried salted meat because it could survive long marches better than fresh carcasses. Sailors relied on it because a ship could not stop every day to gather food. In markets, warehouses, and ports, barrels of salted fish and meat became symbols of stored survival. Workers hauled baskets of salt beneath the sun. Merchants inspected the texture and smell of preserved goods. Officials taxed the trade or guarded access to salt sources. Where salt was scarce, poorer families used it carefully, combining small amounts with drying, fermentation, or smoke. The expense itself shaped diets. Wealthier households could preserve larger quantities, while others had to rely on what local conditions allowed. Fire offered another answer. At some point in the distant past, people noticed that meat hanging near a smoky hearth lasted longer than meat kept elsewhere. The discovery may have begun accidentally. In homes without chimneys, smoke gathered near the roof where strips of meat or fish were often suspended beyond the reach of animals. Over time, the food darkened, dried, and absorbed the smell of the fire. It also resisted insects and decay more effectively. Smoking worked because it combined several effects. Gentle heat removed moisture, while compounds in wood smoke settled onto the surface. The smoke discouraged many insects and slowed some types of spoilage. The process required control. A strong flame could burn the outside while leaving the interior wet. Too little smoke might not protect the food. Thick pieces had to remain above the fire for long periods, sometimes days, while the fuel was carefully managed. In a simple smoking hut, a small fire burned near the floor and food hung from beams overhead. The room filled with smoke, but flames were kept away from the meat. Different woods produced different results. Through experience, communities learned that some types gave a pleasant aroma, while others made food bitter or unsafe. Resinous wood could produce harsh smoke. Dry hardwoods often burned more slowly and evenly. These choices became part of local tradition. Smoking was rarely isolated from other methods. Fish might be salted first, left to release water, and then hung over smoke. Meat could be partially dried in the sun before entering a smokehouse. The finished food was often stored in a dry room, wrapped or hung from rafters. Picture a winter household where dark strips of meat sway above the hearth. The ceiling is blackened, the air stings the eyes, and every cloth smells of wood smoke. To a modern visitor, the room might seem uncomfortable. To the family living there, those hanging pieces represent security. They are meals waiting for the days when snow covers the ground and hunting becomes difficult. Yet smoking also carried risk. If the center remained moist, decay continued unseen. If the food was stored in a damp place afterward, mold could return. A damaged piece might contaminate others. The process demanded attention, and every community developed its own signs of success. Humans also learned something even more surprising. Not every transformation was destruction. Some changes that appeared to be spoilage could produce food that lasted longer, tasted different, and sometimes became easier to digest. This was fermentation, one of the most important and mysterious achievements in the history of food. Ancient people did not know the names of yeast or lactic acid bacteria, but they saw what happened. Grape juice left in a vessel began to bubble and became wine. A mixture of grain and water changed into beer. Milk thickened and turned sour. Dough expanded. Vegetables kept beneath salty liquid developed a sharp flavor instead of simply rotting. Fish mixed with salt broke down into powerful sauces and pastes. These transformations occurred because certain microorganisms consumed sugars and produced acids, alcohol, or gases. The new environment often made it harder for dangerous organisms to dominate to the people using the process. However, success was measured through smell, appearance, flavor, and memory. Fermentation required the right balance. Temperature mattered. Salt levels mattered. Containers had to be reasonably clean. Food sometimes needed to remain beneath liquid so that air could not reach it. A successful batch might be used to begin the next one, creating a living chain of tradition extending across generations. Families recognized the scent of a healthy fermentation and the signs of a failed one. They knew when bubbles were normal and when a container should be discarded. This knowledge could be highly local. A method that worked in a cool mountain settlement might fail in a humid coastal region. Fermentation turned seasonal abundance into durable food. Grapes harvested within a short period could become wine stored for months or years. Grain could become beer, which provided calories and was sometimes safer than contaminated water, depending on how it was produced and handled. Cabbage, roots, cucumbers, and other vegetables could be preserved in brine. The sharpness of fermented food brought variety to diets dominated by grain and dried meat. One of the greatest benefits appeared in dairy. Fresh milk is rich, nourishing, and extremely fragile. In warm weather, it changes quickly. For herding communities, this presented a constant challenge. Animals might produce more milk than a family could drink at once, but without preservation, much of it would be lost. Yogurt, cheese, butter, and related foods transformed that problem into opportunity. A traveler carrying milk in an animal skin bag or clay container might discover that movement, warmth, and naturally present microorganisms caused it to thicken. The result tasted sour but remained useful. Over time, people learned to encourage the change. Fermented milk lasted longer than fresh milk because its increased acidity slowed many harmful organisms. Cheese extended the transformation further. Milk was allowed to curdle either naturally or with substances that encouraged separation. Solid curds formed while liquid whey drained away. The curds could then be pressed, salted, shaped, dried, smoked, or aged. Removing whey reduced moisture. Adding salt provided further protection. A soft cheese might last only a short time, while a hard, dry cheese could remain edible for months. It concentrated valuable fat and protein into a form that was easier to transport. Shepherds moving with flocks could carry cheese where fresh milk would never survive. Soldiers, sailors, and travelers valued it for the same reason. Butter offered another route. Churning separated fat from the liquid portion of milk. Ordinary butter still contained water and milk solids, so it eventually spoiled. But further heating could remove much of that moisture and leave a clarified fat that lasted longer, especially when protected from contamination. In regions with hot climates, this method became particularly important. Preserved dairy allowed communities to use the nutritional wealth of their animals throughout the year rather than only at the moment of milking. It also created remarkable cultural variety. Different climates, animals, containers, microbes, and customs produced different textures and flavors. What began as a survival strategy became cuisine. Acidity offered another defense against decay. Pickling preserved foods by surrounding them with vinegar or salty brine. Vinegar itself often began as wine or another alcoholic liquid that changed through exposure to air and microorganisms. Ancient people may not have understood the chemistry, but they recognized its sharp taste and preserving power. Vegetables, fruits, herbs, roots, eggs, and sometimes meat or fish could be placed into jars filled with acidic liquid. In other cases, salt water encouraged fermentation until the mixture became naturally sour. The key was keeping the food beneath the surface. Anything rising into the air could develop mold. Stones, wooden pieces, leaves, or fitted covers might be used to hold the contents down. At the end of harvest season, a household could fill rows of clay vessels with cucumbers, onions, cabbage, garlic, roots, or fruit. Salt, herbs, seeds, and spices added flavor. Some ingredients may also have slowed certain forms of spoilage, although people chose them mainly through inherited experience. The jars were sealed as well as available materials allowed and placed in a cool, shaded room. Weeks later, the food inside no longer tasted fresh, but it remained crisp, sour, and valuable. During winter, when fields produced little, preserved vegetables provided variety and nutrients. Pickling also allowed people to save crops that ripened all at once. Without preservation, a large harvest might overwhelm a family and rot before it could be eaten. With jars and brine, abundance could be stretched across the year. Another approach was to isolate food from air. Ancient cooks noticed that a protective layer of fat or oil could slow deterioration. Cooked meat might be packed into a vessel and covered with melted animal fat. As the fat cooled, it hardened into a seal. When food was needed, the layer was broken and a portion removed. In Mediterranean regions, cheese, herbs, vegetables, or fish were sometimes stored beneath olive oil. The oil limited direct contact with air, though success depended on the food being properly prepared and free from dangerous contamination before sealing. Honey was especially valued. Because it contains very little available water and is highly concentrated with sugar, honey naturally resists many forms of microbial growth. Ancient people used it not only as a sweetener, but also in medicinal preparations and certain preserved foods. Fruits, nuts, herbs, or plant mixtures could be placed in honey, which protected them while changing their flavor. Wax, resin, cloth, leather, and fitted pottery lids helped close containers. A jar might be sealed with clay or pitch to keep insects and moisture away. Yet sealing carried hidden danger. Wax, resin, cloth, leather, and fitted pottery lids helped close containers. A jar might be sealed with clay or pitch to keep insects and moisture away. Yet sealing carried hidden danger. If contaminated food was trapped inside, the container could preserve the problem along with the meal. A cracked lid, damaged wax, or small opening allowed moisture and pests to enter. Opening a vessel months later required judgment. The smell, surface, pressure, and appearance all mattered. Some preserved foods could survive surprisingly long periods, while others failed despite careful work. No single method guaranteed safety. The people of the past relied on combinations. Cooking followed by sealing, salting followed by drying, fermenting followed by cold storage. The greater the danger of loss, the more layers of protection they used. Of all stored foods, grain often mattered most. Wheat, barley, millet, rice, and other cereals could feed large populations and remain edible far longer than fresh produce, but only if protected from moisture and pests. A harvest brought into storage before it was fully dry could heat, mold, or rot. A leaking roof could destroy months of labor. Insects laid eggs among the kernels. Rodents chewed through baskets and contaminated what remained. Ancient societies responded with specialized storage architecture. Raised granaries lifted grain above damp ground and made access harder for animals. Clay-lined pits insulated supplies and reduced moisture when properly constructed. Large jars protected household portions, while baskets allowed airflow in dry regions. Public warehouses stored food collected as tax or tribute. Thick walls, narrow openings, sealed doors, and guarded entrances protected the supply from thieves as well as pests. Cats, traps, and careful cleaning helped control rodents. Grain had to be inspected, turned, aired, and measured. Imagine entering a great ancient granary. Rows of jars and sacks disappear into the dim interior. Dust hangs in shafts of light. Scribes record quantities while workers carry baskets from one chamber to another. To a ruler, this stored grain is more valuable than decoration or jewels. It can feed workers building monuments, support soldiers during war, calm a city during shortage, or preserve political authority when the harvest fails. A kingdom with reserves might survive drought. A kingdom without them could collapse into hunger and revolt. Food preservation therefore became part of government. Officials measured harvests, collected grain, maintained storehouses, and released supplies when needed. Mistakes or corruption could kill thousands. Natural coal provided another tool, although it was less common and more difficult to control. The idea that cooling began only with electricity is mistaken. In regions with cold winters or nearby mountains, snow and ice could be gathered and stored for later use. Deep pits, underground chambers, thick walls, straw, wood, and earth slowed melting. Some societies built ice houses where winter ice remained into the warm season. Access was often limited to wealthy households, royal courts, temples, or organized communities because collection and maintenance required considerable labor. Ice could cool drinks, preserve delicate foods for short periods, or provide relief during extreme heat. More ordinary families used the stable temperature of the earth. Cellars, caves, and buried storage chambers remained cooler than the daytime air in summer and less exposed to freezing winds in winter. Root vegetables, apples, cheese, wine, and preserved meat could be kept in these places. The goal was not to create the near-freezing environment of a modern refrigerator. Even a modest reduction in temperature slowed decay and extended storage. In hot, dry regions, porous clay vessels offered a different form of cooling. Water slowly evaporating through the walls carried heat away, lowering the temperature inside. 2 containers, damp sand, and moving air could create a simple cooling system. Its effect depended on climate and was strongest where the air was dry. A royal ice chamber and a farmer's earth cellar looked very different, yet both relied on the same principle. Food lasted longer when protected from heat. Preservation became even more essential when people traveled. An army could not march with fields beside it. A ship crossing open water could not depend on daily harvests. Merchants, pilgrims, explorers, and soldiers needed food that resisted spoilage, occupied little space, and survived rough handling. Their supplies included dried meat, salted fish, hard cheese, grain, flour, nuts, dried fruit, fermented drinks, preserved vegetables, and dense bread baked until much of its moisture was gone. Such bread could become so hard that it had to be soaked before eating. Salted meat was often boiled repeatedly. Dried grain was ground or cooked when fuel and water were available. Life on preserved food could be monotonous and unpleasant, but it allowed movement on a scale that fresh supplies could never support. Below the deck of a ship, barrels and jars were packed tightly. Heat, dampness, seawater, insects, and rats threatened everything. A single leaking container could contaminate nearby food. Mold spread in dark corners. Water turned foul. Sailors inspected stores and sometimes discovered that provisions expected to last months were already ruined. Armies faced similar danger. Spoiled food weakened soldiers through hunger or illness before battle began. Supply lines could determine victory more decisively than weapons. The ability to preserve, transport, and distribute food was therefore one of the hidden foundations of conquest and trade. Yet how did anyone know whether stored food was safe? Without thermometers, expiration dates, laboratory tests, or sealed industrial packaging, people depended on their senses and experience. They examined color, texture, smell, surface growth, insect activity, leaking liquid, swelling containers, and unexpected gases. They cut into thick pieces of meat to inspect the center. They tasted small amounts cautiously. They compared the result with what a successful batch should look and smell like. Knowledge often belonged to a specialist within the household or community. Brewers, bakers, dairy workers, fish processors, cooks, healers, or elders who had seen many seasons. Their judgment could be highly skilled, but it was not infallible. Some dangerous contamination produced obvious warning signs, while other threats remained invisible. Parasites, toxins, and disease-causing organisms could survive in food that appeared normal. Mold might be removed from the surface even when harmful compounds had spread deeper. Contaminated water could enter a preparation. Food poisoning was a persistent part of life. It is important not to imagine ancient people as careless or ignorant. They possessed detailed practical knowledge, often adapted with remarkable precision to local conditions. What they lacked was modern microbiology, standardized sanitation, reliable temperature control, and the ability to identify invisible hazards. Their methods reduced risk. They could not eliminate it. Over the centuries, preservation improved. Pottery became more specialized. Barrels and glass containers offered new possibilities. Organized ice harvesting expanded. Insulated iceboxes brought cooling into more homes. Canning used heat in sealed containers to preserve food in a new way. Eventually, mechanical refrigeration transformed storage by continuously removing heat from an enclosed space. The modern refrigerator did not simply replace an ancient box. It replaced a vast collection of daily labor. Before refrigeration, someone had to gather salt, split fish, tend smoke fires, turn drying meat, ferment milk, press cheese, seal jars, inspect grain, maintain a cellar, collect winter ice, and watch constantly for insects, moisture, or mold. The machine reduced many of those tasks to a simple action, placing fresh food on a shelf and closing the door. Refrigeration changed what people ate, how often they shopped, where cities obtained food, and how far fresh products could travel. Meat, milk, fruit, vegetables, and leftovers could remain usable with far less transformation. Seasonal diets became less strict. Long-distance transport expanded. Hospitals, armies, restaurants, and households gained a more reliable defense against decay. Yet the old methods never disappeared. Drying, salting, smoking, fermenting, pickling, aging, and storing food under oil are still practiced across the world. Today, they are valued not only because they preserve food, but because they create flavors that cold storage cannot produce. Smoked fish, aged cheese, cured meat, dried fruit, fermented vegetables, yogurt, vinegar, and countless regional foods carry the memory of an age when survival depended on transformation. Their taste is history made edible. Return now to the ancient village at the beginning of our story. Summer is gone, wind moves across empty fields, and frost hardens the ground. No crops can be harvested, and animals are difficult to hunt. Inside a storage room, however, the shelves and rafters hold the work of many months. Grain rests in sealed containers. Smoked meat hangs above the hearth. Salted fish is packed in jars. Wheels of cheese have hardened in the cool air. Dried fruit fills woven baskets. Fermented vegetables wait beneath brine. Roots lie in an underground chamber where the earth protects them from sudden changes in temperature. None of this food is truly fresh in the modern sense. It has been altered by sun, salt, smoke, acid, time, pressure, and human skill. Yet it remains capable of sustaining life. Every item represents observation accumulated over generations. Somewhere in the distant past, a person noticed that thin meat dried better than thick meat. Someone learned that wet grain ruined the store. Another discovered that milk could become cheese, that fruit could survive in honey, that vegetables remained edible beneath brine, or that smoke drove insects away. These discoveries were remembered because forgetting them carried a terrible price. The survival of a family depended on knowing when to harvest, how to prepare, where to store, and when to discard. The survival of a city depended on granaries and guarded reserves. The reach of an army depended on barrels, sacks, and preserved rations. The success of a voyage depended on whether food could outlast the sea. Ancient people preserved food by removing moisture, adding salt, exposing it to controlled smoke, encouraging useful fermentation, increasing acidity, sealing it from air, hiding it beneath oil or fat, storing it underground, protecting grain from pests, and using natural cold whenever possible. They did not defeat decay completely. They slowed it, redirected it, and learned to work within its limits. That achievement deserves to be seen as one of the foundations of civilization. The refrigerator in a modern kitchen may appear ordinary, but the task it performs once required sunlight, fire, smoke, salt, ice, architecture, vigilance, patience, and the shared knowledge of an entire community. Each time its door opens, it quietly reveals how far humanity has traveled in the ancient struggle against hunger, spoilage, and time.